Good morning, everybody. It's Brian Nemhauser for hawkblogger.com, and as usual, I'm going to do my morning sports chat, and I'm going to stop rocking back and forth in my chair because it'll make you nauseous. But if you have questions along the way, please let me know. I'm happy to take those. I'm going to cover today a couple articles that I wrote. I did a bunch of research in the past week around the best defenses in the NFL, really ever. And in order to do that, I took stats from ProFootballReference.com, which if you don't use is a fantastic site, and basically compiled almost every defensive stat that is tracked and did it over a 3-year period of time, various points throughout history, and then tried to find ways to compare these defenses to one another. And my starting point, looking at absolute numbers like, hey, the 1969 to 71 Purple People Eater Vikings allowed only 9.9 points per game over a 3-year period, which is just ridiculous, right? That's an amazing accomplishment. Comparing that to the Seahawks allowing 15.2 points per game in 2012 to 2014 just didn't feel like an accurate way to measure these teams. So instead what I did is decided to take, I looked at those numbers, I looked at the absolute, and I provided those. I also then went in and looked at how those teams ranked relative to their peers. Were they the number one ranked defense? You assume that they're always the number one ranked defense at the time. That wasn't the case. So I looked at the Steelers in 74 to 76. I looked at the Vikings 69 to 71. The Bears from 84 to 86. Looked at the Ravens from 99 to 01. Included the Bucks from 01 to 03 and the Eagles from 90 to 92. The Eagles one was honestly not one that I consider one of the best defenses, but FootballOutsiders.com has the 91 Eagles defense as the best single-season defense ever, based on their DVOA. So I decided to include them. Honestly, if you read the article, you'll find they really just don't belong. They don't fit. They certainly didn't do 3 years of great work. And there are probably some other defenses that may deserve consideration, but based on research I've done in the past, there was none that really jumped out to me that were worth the time to include. One of the things you'll find when you look at the article is, the Seahawks, where they really stand out is the points allowed. I basically looked at, for that 3-year period of time, what was the standard deviation of points allowed by defenses in the NFL. And then looked at the average points allowed and figured out just how far above the average defense was, these various defenses over a 3-year stretch. And honestly, it's pretty astounding because it's not a surprise that these defenses were considerably better in most cases than the average defense during that period of time. But the Seahawks were basically, have basically been 3 standard deviations above the norm for that 2000 to 2014 3-year time period, which really is crazy. I mean, that is, I don't have a good way to really put that into context, but having poured through all these numbers, I've looked at every stat and I've looked at the standard deviation for every stat over this period, whether it's passer rating, completion percentage, yards per attempt, yards per carry, there's all these stats that you can look at and how the defense has performed. It is very rare for a team to be 2 standard deviations better than the norm. 2.5 is fantastic. It's abnormal. It's elite. 3, when you're getting to 3, you're getting into rarefied air. Very, very few teams, even in a single season, and I'll talk about that in a second, because I did some research there as well for last year, but very, very few teams get to 3 standard deviations better than the league average in any statistic for a single year. The Seahawks, for points allowed and yards allowed, are essentially 3 standard deviations better than the league average for 3 years, for the last 3 years. I mean, They allowed 15.2 points per game in the last 3 years. The next closest is the 49ers, which is around 18, almost 19. And then it's into the 20s. Only one other team besides the Seahawks have allowed less than 20 points a game over the last 3 years. The Seahawks are at 15. So they're actually like a third less than the third place team, which is another thing I looked at. The Bears, the 84-86 Bears, are a dominant team. And obviously they're one of the, if not the best known defense in history. And they had a fantastic stretch. I think they're really the closest to the Seahawks, and I think you could make an argument that they are the best, but they honestly, there was other defenses in that time that were doing some similar things. Maybe not as good, but I made the point that the Seahawks were a 33% essentially better than the third place defense over their 3-year stretch. I think the Bears were only 22%. I mean, there was some other folks doing things that was close or closer. There's more of a grouping. The Seahawks are just far and away dominating this league. And you're right, the rules, I saw that comment come up, the rules are better. They're better for offense. They're incredibly tough to be a good defense. Really hard to keep teams from scoring. This is the highest scoring era in NFL history. Teams are averaging 23 points per game during this 3-year stretch that the Seahawks had their great defensive performance. As I look through, and I want to double check my numbers because it's in my article, which you can check, which I'm just doing now. During the Bears, so the Seahawks played in an era where teams are averaging 23 points per game over that 3-year stretch. The Bears were at 21 points per game. So you're already a 2 points per game difference. And the Seahawks, basically the other difference besides the fact that they're scoring more, you've got faster athletes, bigger athletes. You've got guys that, essentially offensive linemen now or offensive linemen then that wouldn't even play fullback now in some cases. So, huge differences in those teams. It was a surprise to me. Honestly, I expected the team to come out on top would be the Vikings from 69 to 71 because they just did crazy things. And I actually tried, I guess I didn't try, but when I wrote my initial articles last year comparing one defense to another, the 69 Vikings was just off the charts. I mean, they were over three standard deviations ahead of the league average in all sorts of things. They were the best defense I ever really covered or wrote about or explored. But when you stretched it out over 69 to 71, I think the dead ball era, as it's called, in the 70s for the NFL, where scoring just dropped precipitously. I mean, the average scoring during the Steelers' time from 74 to 76 was 19. During 69 to 71 for the Vikings, it was 19.3. So you just had a lot of defenses that were doing similar things, or at least closer to what the Vikings were able to do, which just kind of pulled them down in a comparison's sake with what the Seahawks have done. Now, I think a lot of people, I think it's worthwhile we're on that point. The 74-76 Steelers, that was the best 3-year period of the Steel Curtain that I was able to find. And great defense. They did some amazing things, but there were a lot of other defenses that were similar. The Steelers were essentially 2 standard deviations better than the league average in most ways. And I think if I look at it, they're 2 standard deviations better than the league average that during that period. The Seahawks are 3. So, yes, they have fame. They have more Super Bowl rings, at least at this point. But to claim that the Steel Curtain defense is better than the Seahawks defense, I don't see it. I'd like to see evidence proving me wrong. But Seahawks fans should really be aware. I think mainly what drove me to do this research was just the reality that I don't think people really appreciate how good this defense is. And I think that they're still underrated. I think that time will go by and people will people will say, wow, that was a really good defense. How did they do that? And they'll be talking for decades about, essentially statistical accomplishments that this Seahawks defense was able to do that nobody else will be able to. And Pete Carroll deserves a ton of credit for that. I think what he's done is remarkable. I think he's a defensive genius. I think he deserves that label. I think that anybody that is able to coach under him and get his tutelage is incredibly lucky. And I think the NFL is very lucky for having someone like that challenge this era that they're in. See a question here from Gold Cadillac Gun. I don't know how many Hall of Famers were on that Steel Curtain defense. I'm happy to go back and look it up. If you want, go to ProFootballReference.com, look up the Steelers, and you can actually see their Hall of Famers. Even if I can, we'll see if I can do this while I'm talking, but I'll see if I can pull that up real quick for you. I think that getting back to the Seahawks reference there, I think one of the things that just sticks out to me is you're right, there are Hall of Famers on that Steel Curtain defense. There are Hall of Famers on that Bears defense, Singletary, Dent, And to see, I know people think it's not a big deal, and it isn't really, but to see that the Seahawks are not, sorry, I'm looking here, I'm getting distracted, that Seahawks don't have any top 10 players for last year on a defense that I think is the best in history is crazy. So Rabona23, I don't know if you came on earlier, I think it is hard to compare defenses from different eras. I think you've got rule changes, you've got different athletes, you've got different amounts of teams, which dilutes the amount of talent in the league. There's all sorts of things that change. I think standard deviation is a fantastic way to account for some of those differences, because what you're really doing is you're comparing apples to apples. For that era, how much better than the league average was the defense? Was what they were doing at the time amazing? Was it really good? Was it just PR? I don't think you can look at absolute numbers and say 10 points per game allowed now is the same as 10 points per game allowed in the 70s. When the average team was scoring so much less in the 70s, it was a lot easier to hold teams to 10 points a game or 12 points a game or whatever it would be. So I think that standard deviation gives us that chance to say, what was the league average at that time? How much above or how much better than league average were these defenses? That's apples to apples. That's accounting for differences. I think if you assume that all those differences in the different areas, get covered in statistics. I mean, you're either scoring more or gaining more yards or having more yards per throw, or all those different things should show up in the numbers somewhere. And so now basically you're just saying what's the average and how much better than average were you? And so in that case, I think the Seahawks, really stood out. I'm not quickly coming up with what the Hall of Famers are for the Steelers back then, but I think you can assume Jack Lambert, Jack Ham, Joe Green were probably all Hall of Famers. Trying to see if there's anyone else that jumps out to me back from those days. So the other thing I did is took some of these statistics. No problem. Happy to answer any questions, and feel free if you have other questions to drop them. I also decided to look at for last year. Marcel Darius and the Bills are talking about being the best defense ever, which, as I was just explaining, they have a long way to go. But I decided to look at what the best defenses were in the NFL last year, and I used standard deviation as a way to do that, even last year. So just for 2014 season, which were the teams that really stood out? And I took a little different tack there. I went a little bit more on an index level to say for things like points allowed, yards allowed, completion percentage, passer rating, sacks, turnovers, all those things, how did these different defenses rank? And I put it together in kind of an index. And I overweighted points allowed. I think that's by far the most important defensive number. And when I did that, I got a top 5 ranking. And Seahawks came out on top. Buffalo was second. The the Lions were third, and then it drops off. The Texans and the 49ers were fourth and fifth, and they honestly were pretty far behind the Lions. Similarly, the Bills were the Lions were pretty far behind the Bills from number 3 to number 2, and the Bills were a decent stretch behind the Seahawks from number 2 to number 1. I think that the Bills had a historically good. The Lions had a historically good run defense. They were over 2.5 standard deviations below league average for rush yards allowed per game last year and yards per carry. I think that was, again, one of history's great run defenses with Ndamukong Suh and Nick Fairley. I think you're going to see that team really struggle to maintain that kind of defensive performance. Obviously, the 49ers are probably going to struggle to maintain that defensive performance. One of my takeaways from this is I don't know that there's that many defenses that really can compete with the Seahawks for top honors. I think the Seahawks have a chance to actually be a much better defense this year. They did fantastic last year. They were far and away best scoring defense in that way. Pass yards, yards per carry. There's a lot of things they did that were combination of pass defense, run defense that no other defense did, where there just really wasn't a great way to attack them. They did all this without almost any turnovers. They were a league average team in takeaways. They were a league below average team in sacks. And so if you start getting more of those, this defense is going to be even better than it was last year. I have a feeling this defense could be the best of the bunch for the Seahawks. This could be a 4-year stretch of defense that the NFL's never seen. The Seahawks are 3 straight years number 1 ranked in points allowed, 2 straight years number 1 ranked in yards allowed. If they go for a 4th straight year in points allowed being ranked number 1, that'll be the first time that's ever been done, at least since after the merger in 70. If they go 3 straight years in number 1 ranked in yards allowed, they'll tie the 84-86 Bears as the only other team that's done that. So really outstanding stuff going on there. And that is really what I was going to cover for this morning. If anybody's got questions, I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, I'll post this and try to do this as often as I can each morning and hopefully get to know you guys better and give you some more insight into what I'm writing about and why I'm writing about it. All right, take care, everybody.